Well, there's no question in the United States we have a shrinking workforce.
These are some of the hardest working people on earth, and they literally feed the nation. Shame on this federal administration for doing this.
Within just a few months, 5 major markets from the Philippines to France, South Korea to Mexico, and even Italy abruptly turned away from American wheat. No announcements, no negotiations. They simply stopped buying. The reason wasn't price. Canada offered wheat at a higher cost, yet it was chosen. Because in today's global agricultural supply chains, buyers don't want cheap, they want stable and reliable. The impact on American farmers was immediate and brutal. From Kansas to Nebraska, grain silos overflowed with unsold wheat. There were no buyers, no seasonal workers to help with harvests. Thousands of farmers were denied credit for the next planting cycle. Some had no choice but to burn their ripened crops just to clear the land. This isn't just a drop in exports. It's a quiet retreat from global trust, and America's farmers are the first casualties. From lost contracts to looming bankruptcy are U.S. farmers now facing a silent erasure on the very land they once believed could feed the world. Behind the headlines and trade figures lies a harsher truth. America's farmers aren't just losing money, they're losing viability. In 2025, projected cash receipts from crop sales, including wheat, are set to fall by $5.6 billion compared to the previous year. But the damage goes far beyond spreadsheets. Across the Midwest, a growing number of farmers report being cut off from new credit. Without loans, they can't buy fertilizer repair equipment or hire the workers needed to bring in their crops. In Kansas, any modest rise in farm income for 2025 is not the result of a market recovery. It's the product of $2 billion in federal aid designed to cushion the blow. But subsidies can't mask the deeper erosion, a system strained by falling exports, rising uncertainty, and labor shortages driven by stricter immigration policies. With too few hands to harvest, too few dollars to invest, some wheat fields are being left to rot. Others are burned outright, not as a protest, but as a last resort. The Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City reports growing signs of financial distress, farmers defaulting on loans, shutting down operations, and leaving the land altogether. Experts warn that tariff instability is amplifying rural job losses and turning a trade dispute into a full-blown employment crisis. So, if even the land that once fed America now stands abandoned, what then is left for those who have nothing but that land? As export orders vanished and silos filled to the brim, Washington didn't stay silent. But while statements were made and subsidies approved the core issues driving the crisis, unstable policy, shrinking labor and lost trust remained untouched. The Trump administration reaffirmed its hardline stance, no change to tariffs on the EU or Asia, despite mounting pressure from farm lobbies. In press conferences, officials pointed to ongoing negotiations and promised long-term gains. On the ground, farmers saw none of it. Instead, they faced the consequences of a tightening immigration policy that continued to choke off seasonal labor. In states like Illinois and Texas, growers reported widespread crop losses simply because there were no hands to harvest them and no signs that would change. To ease the blow, over $2 billion in federal aid was directed to wheat-producing states like Kansas. But agricultural economists from the University of Illinois, analysts at the Farm Bureau, offered a blunt assessment. Subsidies might keep farms afloat for now, but they do nothing to restore lost markets or investor confidence. As one expert put it, it's a bandage, not a cure. And so, after all the press briefings, political posturing, it was still farmers who bore the cost, unable to hire, unable to sell, unable to grow, left with federal checks that couldn't buy back trust or bring back the markets that once made their harvests worth something. If this is what support looks like, what does abandonment look like? And then came the break. While Washington debated tariffs and subsidies, the first decisive move didn't come from a rival, but from one of America's closest agricultural partners, the Philippines. For years, the Philippines had imported nearly 6.9 million metric tons of wheat annually, with the U.S. supplying roughly 2.7 million of that, about 39%. American wheat was familiar, affordable, and dependable, or at least it used to be. But in May 2025, a major Filipino buyer abruptly canceled a 12,000-ton shipment of American wheat. Within days, they signed a new 110,000-ton contract, not with the U.S., but with Canada and Australia. The reason: stability. While U.S. wheat was cheaper by $8 to $10 per ton, buyers now viewed it as a risky bet, vulnerable to policy swings, supply disruptions, and labor shortages. What once felt like a safe default choice had become a political gamble. The repercussions were immediate. In Kansas, inventories ballooned. With no viable export outlet and no labor to harvest what remained, some farmers resorted to burning crops in the field to avoid further losses. Across the heartland, frustration boiled over. But this wasn't just about one country or one contract, and the Philippines was just the beginning. Across the Atlantic and throughout North America, other partners were already lining up to make their own quiet exits. The rupture didn't end in the Pacific. It traveled across the Atlantic and landed in Brussels. In the eyes of European buyers, the problem with American wheat wasn't just political. It was technical, regulatory, and deeply systemic. By 2025, U.S. exports no longer met the European Union's evolving standards on emissions, chemical residues, and customs documentation. What used to pass inspection now triggered red flags. France, one of the EU's largest wheat importers, began quietly shifting its contracts. Even amid domestic harvest challenges, French millers and grain companies opted for Canadian wheat. The reason Canada didn't just meet the bar, it raised it. With digitized supply chains, near real-time protein control, and guaranteed delivery timelines within 12 days, Canada became the model of modern grain logistics. In contrast, American shipments faced delays, inconsistent paperwork, and growing scrutiny over pesticide use and carbon intensity. According to Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, wheat exports excluding durum were projected to rise by 2.4% for the 2025-26 season, with the EU as one of the key growth markets. That uptick came directly at the expense of U.S. producers who once dominated the transatlantic grain corridor. But in this new landscape, lower price alone couldn't outweigh higher risk. For European importers, governed by regulation and driven by reputation, consistency was worth paying more for. And as Europe pivoted north, it sent a signal far beyond Brussels. The shift wasn't about loyalty, it was about standards. And America, for now, was falling short. The break from American wheat didn't stop with distant markets or technical disputes. It reached straight into the heart of North America, to a partner tied to the U.S. by trade deals, shared borders, and decades of agricultural cooperation, Mexico. Once one of the most dependable buyers of U.S. wheat, Mexico began pulling away in 2025. Imports of American wheat fell sharply, while Canadian shipments surged up 35% in just a few months. The shift was swift, but not sudden. It had been building quietly with each new disruption. The issue wasn't quality or yield, it was bureaucracy. Mexican importers grew weary of America's shifting paperwork, erratic regulatory enforcement, and unpredictable tariff policies. What once felt like routine cross-border trade began to feel like rolling dice. Missed delivery windows, customs delays, and sudden cost increases pushed buyers to reconsider their loyalties. Canada offered something simpler, reliable documentation, stable pricing, and consistent on-time delivery. No surprises, no renegotiations. For Mexican millers, this wasn't just about economics, it was about operational security. A missed shipment could disrupt entire food supply chains. And in 2025, U.S. wheat became a risk they could no longer afford. That Mexico, America's neighbor, trade partner, and historical agricultural ally, would turn northward instead of looking next door was more than a logistical decision. It was a warning, one that echoed across the continent. Even proximity and partnership aren't enough when reliability is lost. Mexico's quiet departure might have seemed like the turning point, but in truth, it was just the midpoint of a broader unraveling. Beyond North America, other key markets were making their own calculations. And what they revealed was not just dissatisfaction with paperwork or politics, but deeper concerns about quality, safety, and long-term reliability. In South Korea, where consumer trust in food safety is paramount, American wheat once commanded 35% of market share. But by mid-2025, that figure had dropped to just 17%. The cause lay not in price, but in the presence of glyphosate, a herbicide that, while widely used in the U.S., had become a growing concern among Korean regulators and consumers alike. With residue levels in American shipments often testing between 200–400 parts per billion, far exceeding the new safety thresholds, Korean buyers began looking elsewhere. Canada responded with precision, offering wheat backed by digital residue certifications and supply chain transparency down to the farm level. It was a clean, traceable, and regulation-compliant alternative, and South Korea embraced it without hesitation. Meanwhile, in Europe, Italy, the cradle of pasta and custodian of some of the most demanding wheat standards in the world, took a different path. There was no regulatory clash, no public declaration. Instead, there was silence. American wheat, once a reliable presence in Italian contracts, quietly lost ground. Importers shifted toward Canadian suppliers, not because of controversy, but because of chemistry. Canada had introduced new wheat strains optimized for pasta production with the exact gluten elasticity and protein levels prized by Italian manufacturers. Paired with real-time shipping logistics and digital freshness tracking, Canadian wheat simply became the better match. American exporters didn't lose these markets in a day. But as demands changed and expectations rose, the US failed to adapt or even notice. Where South Korea drew a line and walked away, Italy simply turned the page. Neither made noise, but both made their choices. By the time Italy and South Korea made their quiet exits, the pattern had already become unmistakable. It wasn't just one contract lost in Manila, or a customs dispute in Paris, or an inspection failure in Seoul. It was something larger, a slow erosion of confidence playing out across continents and across sectors almost without headlines. There was no trade war, no coordinated boycott, no single moment of rupture. And yet, the US wheat industry finds itself increasingly isolated, not because it's uncompetitive on price, but because it is no longer seen as a predictable long-term partner. Buyers from Asia to Europe to Latin America are recalibrating what reliability means, and in each case they're landing on the same conclusion. Stability, traceability, and consistency now matter more than cost. Canada has not undercut the US on price. In many cases it charges more. But it delivers exactly what today's buyers demand: standardized documentation, clean residue profiles, real-time logistics, and policies that don't shift with every new headline out of Washington. And that reliability, not technology, not even grain quality alone, is what's quietly redrawing the global trade map. This is not a short-term dip in exports caused by cyclical weather or temporary drought. It is a restructuring of global trust, one that has unfolded gradually, silently, and without protest. Markets haven't slammed the door on American farmers. They've simply walked away without saying a word. And the longer this drift continues, the more it becomes normalized, the harder it will be to reverse. Because once a buyer rebuilds their supply chain around another source, they rarely come back. The question now isn't how many contracts have been lost. It's how many relationships built over decades are being quietly rewritten without anyone in Washington seeming to notice until it's too late. And if this is how the world moves on from American wheat, without anger, without fanfare, just with quiet substitution, what happens when it's soybeans next, or corn, or beef? What do you think? Is this still salvageable? Or are we watching something deeper, more permanent take hold? Leave your thoughts below, and let's open this conversation up.